Hello, and welcome back to my messy basement. This week in operating systems, we had kind of a short week. There was a holiday on Monday, and then we had a term test yesterday. So we're kind of in the middle of things right now, but that's okay. So let's take a look at where we're at right now, and then we'll talk a little bit about where we're going to be next week. So, at the beginning of this week, we were kind of finishing up with the locking and deadlock stuff from last week. In particular, what we focused on at the beginning of this week was identify code protecting a critical section that would result in deadlock and propose solutions that would avoid and or prevent said deadlock. And that was the exercise that we did in class where we took some time to look at some code that was for transferring money in between accounts. The textbook does a pretty good job of describing the idea of deadlock and the four conditions necessary for deadlock to happen for it to be possible. But the exercise that we did in class was going through the process of trying to make changes to code and see how how we can actually fix it, how we can show that deadlock will not happen for a specific piece of code. As you know, this was assessed on the term test, and that's where you can expect to see that. And like I said before, you're going to be implicitly assessed on this in the assignment for assignment 2. So in assignment 2, you're going to be using condition variables in a program. This is both for lab 2 and assignment 2. And one of the things that you'll be doing with condition variables and one of the things that you'll be doing with locks is simulating a scheduler, which takes us into this week. And you're going to be implicitly assessed on fixing code that results in deadlock because you are going to be writing code where it's possible for that code to deadlock. You're going to be using several different locks and you're going to have several different threads. And so it's going to be part of your job to try and make sure that deadlock doesn't happen with the code that you're writing. This week, we spent some time taking a look at scheduling, and the topics that we were thinking about were compare and contrast preemptive and non-preemptive or cooperative multitasking. This was assessed on the term test in the last question about scheduling, where I was asking you to compare the round robin scheduling policy and the shortest job first scheduling policy. Or where I was asking you to compare the two scheduling policies. One of them was preemptive and one was non-preemptive. This is really related kind of back to the first week of the course where we're talking about things like context switching and mode switching. So our operating system's responsibility is to do context switching and then also to have things like system calls. Context switching and then the timer interrupt, the hardware timer interrupt, and mode switching. This is preemptive, and the non-preemptive is where we're adding system calls. So a process or a task is voluntarily switching to the operating system space and allowing the operating system to take over. Compare and contrast different scheduling policies. This was something that we did in class as an exercise where we were looking at some of the basic scheduling policies. So we were looking at things like measuring the response time and the turnaround time for tasks based on the different kinds of policies, and then deciding whether or not those scheduling policies were fair based on how they behaved. And what we kind of found was that non-preemptive scheduling policies they're not fair. They're not fair because it's kind of up to the task to decide when it's going to give up access to that CPU. Evaluate the performance of scheduling policies is related to compare and contrast different scheduling policies. Those, again, those were on the test, as you know. Those are not likely to be on the final exam. It's possible, like this is going to be a cumulative final exam, but you can make a judgment about something not really being as important or as heavily assessed in the final exam if you've already seen it on the term test. Especially getting into the next learning outcome here, write a Unix program that implements scheduling policies. I'll talk about this a little bit on Monday's class, but write a Unix program that implements scheduling policies. Assignment 2 is you are going to be writing a simulator for a multi-level feedback queue. So you're going to be simulating hardware, and the way that you're simulating hardware is with threads. The environment is basically going to be that you are simulating a multi-CPU environment using multiple threads of execution. Describe a scheduling algorithm used by a modern operating system. This is coming directly from Chapter 9, and this is talking about the Linux Completely Fair Scheduler. You were not assessed on this in the term test, and it's possible for you to see this going forward in another kind of written assessment, like a final exam. But that comes almost entirely from Chapter 9. We may, depending on the amount of time that we have at the end of the course, we may spend some time taking a look at the Linux kernel source code and just taking a look and kind of see where is CFS and where is the scheduling policy implemented in the Linux kernel. But for now, we're just going to leave this to be a textbook reading. The chapter for that one specifically, so chapter 9, there's only certain parts that you're required to read. So 9.6 is an optional reading. You don't necessarily have to read that part, but the rest of it is going to be required for that outcome, describing scheduling algorithm used by a modern operating system. Moving forward, we're going to start with this IO scheduling and physical representation. We're going to start with this next week after I spend a little bit of time talking about the assignment and talking about lab 2 and kind of going over a sample solution to lab 2 on Monday. The parts that we're going to be looking at really specifically in class are talking about the way that a hard drive does scheduling, the way that we do scheduling for I/O. Describe how an operating system communicates with hardware devices. This is chapter 36 in the video, and this is really about hardware drivers. So how does an operating system abstract the idea of a hardware device so that when we write a program, we don't really have to think much about what the keyboard actually looks like. And I'm recording this right now with OBS. OBS doesn't have to know anything about how all different kinds of webcams work. It just has to know, how does this operating system implement a webcam? Compare and contrast methods for improving the performance of communication between operating systems and hardware devices. This is talking about DMA, direct memory transfer, and basically, sticking a computer inside your computer so that it can do other work while your main CPU does more important things. Explain how an operating system provides abstraction around hardware devices. Again, this is kind of related to device drivers and the layering approach. So how a device driver fits into this whole structure and how it fits into communicating with the hardware device and how the operating system is doing that. We'll spend a little bit more time in class talking about describe the physical structure of a hard drive. I'm going to bring a drive to class and I'm going to rip it apart and I'm going to show it to you because I think it's cool to take a look at the actual innards of a drive. Given a disk layout, describe what happens as an I/O request for a block or file is serviced. This is kind of related to compare and contrast I/O scheduling policies. This bottom part here, compare and contrast I/O scheduling policies. So once we see what a disk looks like, what's actually happening when a request is made for I/O. So when an operating system makes a request, when your program makes a request for I/O, the operating system does a bunch of stuff to work with the drive to be able to get to the data that you're trying to get to. This part we're not going to spend a lot of time on in class, and it's mostly in chapter 37. Compare and contrast I/O and scheduling policies and process scheduling policies. So we're going to take a look at these in kind of conjunction. And with the I/O scheduling policies and process scheduling policies, to spoil this a little bit, what you're going to see is that some of the unrealistic assumptions that were made for process or task scheduling policies are not unrealistic assumptions to make for I/O scheduling policies. And we'll get a sense of what that means when we're talking about this in class. Next week, we've got a full week. We're kind of back to regular schedule here. And part of the purpose of doing this I/O stuff before we get to what we're talking about next week, which is file systems, is that the I/O stuff motivates the design of file systems. So knowing a little bit about how a hard drive is structured tells us a little bit about how an operating system might want to implement a file system. So we'll look at these learning outcomes next week, but just to give you a preview of what's going on, the reason for looking at hard drives and I/O devices and stuff is, again, to motivate the design of file systems. So that's it for where we're at in terms of the course. I will publish a video later today describing the kind of like approximate solutions to the term test questions. I want to give you an opportunity to do some self-assessment in the event that I'm not able to get the term test back to you before the VW date. We're going to make our very best efforts, but the graders and me, we're people, we've got lots of stuff going on, and I really want to get it to you. We're going to do the best that we can, but in the event that we can't, I want to make sure that you have some ability to do some self-assessment before the VW date happens. So you should expect to find that posted to the course website a little bit later today. And I think that's it for now. I hope that you have a great weekend, and I will see you on Monday. Bye.